thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and to my esteemed colleagues from the department and from other departments who are present, as well as from other parts of India. My teaching style is a little bit different than I think what is typical. As you'll see, I'm kind of low technology teaching style. I still use whiteboards and blackboards and so on. Over the years, I've been teaching full-time for now 12, 13 years in different parts of the United States as well as in England. And I found that often the PowerPoint presentations can get in between the speaker and the student. And so I'm going to put minimal things on the board, terms and things like that, that I want you to pay attention to. The other thing I want to mention is that I don't intend to lecture continuously for 2 hours. I'll be speaking, but my hope is that, actually my requirement is that all of you participate. So I'll be raising questions, and please raise your hand, and whoever I'll call on, then you can provide an answer to that question. There's no right or wrong answers to the questions that I offer. It's not a test of your knowledge of any kind, but I want to get some participation so that it becomes interactive, and so that we can actually try to apply the hermeneutical techniques and theories that we take a look at, instead of just making it a one-way transmission. So we have a couple of hours, and listening to someone speak continuously for 2 hours is a challenge. So I want to do this in the way that a postgraduate seminar is usually taught. So please feel free, and if you have a question along the way, then also please raise your hand, and I'll be happy to take a pause and answer your question. So first, a couple of terminological, some definitions, okay? And if you're already familiar with this, then my apologies. Just as a review, when we speak of religious studies, we are speaking of a discipline that is not concerned with matters of ultimate truth. Religious studies as a field was developed historically not too long ago. It emerges from the period of the Enlightenment, but only really becomes developed in the last 100 years or so, even less than that in many parts of the world, as a discipline that studies what human beings do and what they claim to do when they are being religious. So it's the study of human beings and their claims, not the study of God and ultimate reality. Religious studies developed in contrast with theology. Theology is a much older discipline. It is called the queen of the sciences at some point. It used to be the foundation of most major universities, at least in the Western world, but also all over the world. Theology is the study of God, faith-seeking understanding, where we begin from a place of faith and then try to ask questions. It's also an academic discipline, but religious studies is something different. Religious studies says we are going to bracket the question of truth. That means we're going to set it aside for now. Is there a God? There may be, there may not be. That's not a question that religious studies will try to answer. Is this religion true, or is this one false? That's a decision that each person can make on their own, or with the help of their priest or guru or however. But in religious studies, we set aside the question. Religious studies is the study of human beings and what they are doing when they claim to be religious. So whenever I give examples from any particular religion or any scripture, you have to understand that I'm not making any claims about whether that's true or that's false, or whether it's good or whether it's bad. Okay? I'm not trying to do that. There's no implication of that. Rather, we're studying it in terms of its textual meanings, its interpretation. As Dr. Madhavi was saying, hermeneutics means to express, to interpret, to translate, to understand. Hermeneutics is both a method and also a philosophy of interpretation, both things. How do you do interpretation well, both in terms of its method and why should you do interpretation? What are the proper ways of interpretation? What is improper interpretation? All of those questions that have to do with explaining and interpreting come under the field of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is something that has been practiced in every textual tradition of the world. The term itself emerges, as Dr. Madhavi has explained well, it emerges from the biblical practice of textual interpretation, but not using that term everywhere in the world. Wherever people have studied texts, they have been concerned with what is proper and improper forms of interpretation. How do you understand things when they do not make sense, or when a text contradicts itself, or when the historical context does not match what is being said? How do you interpret something like that? Okay? So, I want to start with a very straightforward example. And this is an example that comes from the New Testament. All the Gospels have it, but specifically the Gospel according to Matthew, in using the classic translation, the translation that it has itself become a classic, from the King James Version of the Bible. The reason I begin with this example is because it's often easier to see hermeneutics at work in a tradition that is distant from our own. When we look at texts that we ourselves hold to be sacred or important, or we are emotionally connected to, it can be both difficult and challenging to take a critical hermeneutical approach. Once you learn the process of hermeneutics, then you can take it and apply it closer to home, which is a riskier business. Now, since this is the Department of Sanskrit, my guess is that the Bible is going to be more distant to most of you than other texts. Okay, so this is why I begin with that example. I think the only exception to this will be Dr. D'Souza, who is himself a scholar of the biblical interpretation. Okay, so this is just a simple line. It's just one sentence, so I don't think I need to write it. I'm sure most of you have heard it before. When Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Maybe you've heard this before. Blessed are the meek, or the humble, for they shall inherit the earth. Now, let's say someone doesn't know anything about Christianity. They've never met a Christian, they've never seen the Bible. Someone might take a very simplistic attempt at interpreting this. Okay, so I don't know anything about Christianity, never read the Bible, whatever. I see this line, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," and I think, this is making a ridiculous claim. It's saying if you are humble and you don't speak up and you're meek, you will become king of the earth. We've never seen this happen. In fact, most people at work need to be aggressive in order to keep rising in their field, right? So this is a false and ridiculous statement. If we take a interpretation of it that is born from ignorance, if I know nothing about it. And this is typically what happens when there's a lack of hermeneutical knowledge. People read the sacred texts of different traditions, and they go, "Oh, this is what it says. See, obviously this book is foolish." But if we turn the argument upside down, we can say, obviously it's not foolish, otherwise why would millions and millions of people around the world take it seriously? Something else is going on, right? So we have to give credit to the text itself. This is the first principle. Just like Dr. Madhavi was saying in her speech, we have to give credit to Kalidasa that he has some intelligence. We can dismiss it right away and say, "Oh, he's a fool." But then, if that's the case, why are we reading the text anyway? The only reason to read a text is because it has something worth saying. So let's give the text credit first. There must be something else going on here. So, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. If we were to give a simple theological explanation, and if Dr. Keith doesn't mind, if I can put him on the spot here, what would be like a two-sentence theological interpretation that is fairly typical of Christians for this sentence? Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So not using violent means, that is being meek, how does that give you the earth? How would that lead to inheriting? What does inheriting the earth mean, theologically?
Inheriting the earth could be many things.
Yes. Just one example.
Yeah. It could mean well-being for activity with others.
So we could take it in the present time, right? Like Dr. D'Souza is saying, we say, blessed are the meek. If we have that humility and we don't commit violence in the world, then our life in the world will be full of well-being and goodness. This is how we're going to inherit the earth. Or we can take it in an apocalyptic sense. We can take it in terms of day of judgment. That one day in Christianity you have this timeline, right? It's a linear timeline, that history is moving towards the day of judgment, towards God's presence. So some theologians have argued that this means that if we are humble and we're servants of God, then when the time comes, the second coming happens of Jesus, of the apocalypse takes place, and so on, then at that point we will inherit the earth. The earth will belong to those who are righteous, those who are good. So we can take it in terms of time, future. So there's many different theological interpretations that are possible of this sentence. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That's a theological or multiple theological approaches. Now, suppose we were to interpret the same sentence from a historical context, using historical hermeneutics. So, not theological, but in terms of history. And we ask ourselves, what was happening? So Jesus is speaking this in Israel amongst his followers, or amongst the general crowd, the masses who have assembled there. He's standing up and saying on top of the mountain, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. What is going on in Israel at that time when Jesus is making this statement? We have to ask the question historically, what is the context? And if you look at that history, okay, again, summarizing very, very briefly, just for the sake of example, at that point, the Romans are ruling, and many in the Jewish tradition expect a Messiah to come, someone who is someone who's going to liberate, to save the Jewish people. And the Messiah they expect, many of them expect it to be a revolutionary, someone who shows up and is going to militarily displace the Romans and give the Jews their autonomy back. In that context, where there is social revolutionary ferment building, if someone comes, who people are pointing to as the Messiah, and says, no, you don't need to go be revolutionary. You don't have to go fight. Blessed are the meek. Be humble, and then you will inherit the earth. Now you see why that statement is revolutionary. It's radical. Why Jesus would have been a threat to the people of his time. Those who wanted a more active revolutionary change. If there's agitation for independence and battle and war, and someone says, no, you should be humble, be meek, and you will get what you want. That's going to be radical, right? The meaning of the sentence changes. We get insight into it the moment we examine the historical context. Now, we did a theological interpretation. We've done a historical one. Now, for the sake of illustration, let's push this a little farther. What if we were to do a Marxist interpretation of that sentence? Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. What would that look like? Yeah, something like a class struggle, right? If we were to go back to Marx and Engels' own writings, they say that religion has the scent of oppression from the upper. Religion is a product of the superstructure of society, the leaders, the bourgeoisie, who impose their ideas on the commoners using religion as the main mechanism. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, is telling what? All of you common people, be quiet, accept your place, keep working hard, do not revolt against me. I am the ruler, and as long as you do that, you stay quiet, I promise you in your next life you'll go to heaven and you'll rule everything. In this way, this sentence serves my interests, which is to keep my citizenry quiet and under control. So Marxist interpretation of religion has never been something that religious people have found to be particularly appealing. Okay, but we can do something even more. Okay, in the history of Christian theology, all of these have been used, but there's also been something called liberation theology, which takes the Bible as a platform to not oppress the weak, but to elevate them, but to lift them up. And from the perspective of liberation theology, if we were to read this statement, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, it says that God exalts those who are the weakest amongst us. Those who are weak, those who are poor. The previous, or another sentence there, says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs shall be the kingdom of God. The poor are actually elevated, right? God is present within those who are poor, within those who are weak, within those who humble themselves, rather than those who are in positions of power. So liberation theology takes the critique of Marx and turns it on its head and says, actually, this statement is not supporting those who are in power. It is speaking up against them. Liberation theology says that we have to speak truth to power. Someone has to come up. The meek have to come up and say, no, this earth belongs not to you who are arrogant, but to those who are humble and those who are poor in spirit. And liberation theology has had a huge impact in places like South America, when Christians and Catholics had to rise up against oppressive regimes just in the last half century or so. Liberation theology developed there as a way to speak up against those who are in positions of power by saying God actually favors those who are meek, those who are humble. So, all this as an example, just an example, to show you one sentence, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. How many multiple interpretations we produced depending on the hermeneutical method and the hermeneutical theory that we employed, or the lens through which we looked in order to interpret the sentence. And I did not include the ignorant one. That was the first one, where we misread it because we didn't have any knowledge of what the statement was saying. Okay? Here? This is to demonstrate how important hermeneutics is. Whether we like it or not, we all do hermeneutics. But we can do it poorly or we can do it well. If we don't learn what it is, we do it in an ad hoc way, we do it in an assumed way, and we make all kinds of assumptions that do not hold. If we do it with knowledge, then we know what we're doing and we can accomplish what we want to accomplish using whatever method we like. These are just 4 we could use many other hermeneutical lenses in order to interpret the same statement. Okay, so there are several hermeneutical guidelines that hermeneutics is a whole major area of study. There's endless what we can talk about. But there's certain things that scholars of hermeneutics give again and again as fundamental principles in terms of how hermeneutics is done. And I want to give you four key principles that are across the board given by scholars as good practices when it comes to applying hermeneutics. So some guidelines, you can say. The first, you read slowly, you read thoroughly, and you read repeatedly. This first principle seems very obvious, and yet it flies in the face of most people's reading practices today. Thanks to internet and data on our phones and the ability to search anything on Google, our reading practices tend to be, oh, I want to know something about hermeneutics, so I punch it into Google, and of course there's a Wikipedia page that comes, and I read the Wikipedia page while I'm running to my next meeting, and I skim through it and pick up a few important points, and we're good. That's not hermeneutical reading. It will never lead to good understanding. This search, copy, cut, paste doesn't work. Okay? Reading slowly and thoroughly means we sit down with the text and we read again, and we have no eye on the watch. We're trying to go deeply into every sentence, and we're willing to go through it over and over and over again. What this does, see, when we approach a text, we come to it with certain preconceived notions of what it is. When I told you, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, each one of you had certain preconceived notions. I had certain preconceptions. This does not mean something negative, okay? Even if you're a Christian, you will have certain preconceptions of what the text means. A Christian might go to the text and their preconception might be, this is so inspiring, this is wonderful, this is the truth. Someone else in another religion may say, oh, this is that standard thing I've heard, it's all false, it's all fake, I don't believe any of it. Someone else may have another preconception, this is fine literature, and so on and so forth. We all bring certain preconceptions. That is unavoidable. The key is to continuously modify those preconceptions by reading the text closely. And this creates one form of the hermeneutical circle. So basically, we have our preconceptions, and we have understanding of the text. So we come to a text with certain preconceptions. If we read slowly and thoroughly, our preconceptions are modified by our interaction with the text. We read it and we say, actually there's a lot more here than it met the eye. Hopefully, when we went through those four interpretations of that passage, some of you were thinking that, right? Oh wow, this line can mean a lot more than I initially thought it meant. Your understanding of the text is modified. Now, so you read it, now your preconceptions are changed because we read it carefully, the preconceptions are changed. You have now new preconceptions about the text. Next time you read it, you will understand the text more deeply with that new understanding, which will again give you new insight, which will modify your conceptions of the text. right? So it's a simple process. This is why reading repeatedly is so important, because each time you read the text, you are modified. It's not just that you learn more, but your ideas, your understanding has changed. Guideline number 1. The second thing I want to mention is that this is probably the most important of all of them. Context is critical. If there's one thing that I can say is the gift of the humanities to human knowledge, to human society, it is the insistence, the awareness of context. So often we look at things in the world, we interpret them based on our first impressions. But if we understand any statement, any text, any image, any icon within the context that produced it, or multiple contexts, it changes our understanding of the text significantly and thoroughly. What kinds of contexts are there? If I were to ask you, okay, if you're reading a text, what are the contexts? That is, what is the surrounding situation that will impact your understanding of the text? What kinds of contexts are there? Can anyone suggest? Yes. Yeah, the big one is definitely historical context. Historical context says, let me understand the environment within that produced the text, because that's going to affect how I interpret it. What else? The geographical context. What else? Social. Both of you said it together. In social, we might include things like class, status. We might include gender, although these days probably most people would list gender as a separate context. It's very important in terms of doing a gendered reading of a text. So we ask ourselves, and we can go on, we can talk about our personal context, the context of the reader who's studying the text, because that will also affect how you interpret it. Yes, the audience as well. Author's context. Cultural context. Yes. Political context is crucial as well, because we'll talk about this more later, but when you read through the political context, you understand who is benefiting from the text, who's being impacted by it. So I'll give you another example. I come from the state of Utah in the United States, which is where I teach, and there we have the majority religious group there is a branch of Christianity called Mormonism. It's the Latter-day Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a specific branch of Christianity which is recognized as Christian by many, and other Christians say that they're not actually Christian. So there's some controversy, but they're a little bit different in their approach. They consider themselves to be Christians. And if you look at their history, then in the very early period of their church, they allowed non-white people to become priests. Blacks were allowed. And at a certain point, from the majority of their history until about the 1960s and 70s, blacks were disallowed from becoming priests. So only white members of the church could become priests within that church. In the 60s and 70s, that changed. Why did it change? Because the prophet of the church received a revelation from God, which is how they receive most of their teachings, received a revelation from God saying that it was God's will that all men should be able to become priests within the church. Now, from the surface of the statement, from the face of it, this is a revelation from God. Things have changed. The church is much better because of that revelation, and more equal, more egalitarian. But if we were to look at the historical context or the political contexts, what's happening at that time in the United States, 1960s and 70s? This is the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and he's inspired by Gandhi, etc., etc. And there's this movement towards civil disobedience and nonviolence and civil rights. And all throughout the United States, the position of blacks is changing within the culture. So if we look at it, remember, religious studies is not about asking questions about the truth in the ultimate sense. Did God give a revelation to the prophet? Maybe, maybe not. That's not our question. It could very well be that God gave a revelation. What we have to ask is, what is the historical context that gave birth to that revelation? And if you look at it in the context of the civil rights movement, it makes complete sense. Churches all over the United States are opening their doors at that time to those who are not white. It gives us a different perspective on that same revelation. Let me say again that that does not preclude the possibility that God also spoke to the prophet. We're not saying that because they're responding to the political context, therefore God was not involved. He may be involved. It's just that that question is not our concern. Because I don't have access to the conversation between the God and prophet. Right? That's something beyond us. All we can study is that historical, political, social, racial, gender context, etc. Now the current controversy in that church is of gender. The question of whether women can become priests or not. And that's a huge issue there that's taking place. And is causing a lot of disturbance and a lot of disagreement within that church. Okay? So this is the second. Context is critical. It's crucial. Excellent. So thank you for adding that, because one important context that we failed to mention, Dr. Madhavi is pointing out, is the context within the text itself. So if you're reading a passage and you read it in the context of the text, so again, this goes against our search mentality today, where we find a quote from some text or some place, you pull it out and then you post it on Facebook, and everyone says, "Hi, ye likha hai." And they have no idea what came before and what came after. Right? This happens all over the place. You can go online and you can find crazy things that supposedly Jesus said and that Krishna said and that Muhammad said. Everyone says these things because they're pulled out of context, put on some chat board, and people then interpret it. They use hermeneutics, but they interpret it based on a hermeneutics of ignorance. They don't know what the context is, and specifically they don't know who's speaking. What came before, what came after. So the famous commentator on the Bhagavata, Sridhara Swami, he says at the beginning of his commentary, he says, "I will write my commentary with attention to what came before, Purva, and what came after in the text." Right? So I will interpret it based on the context within the text that is present. So that's another context that we need to pay attention to. Okay. So thank you for adding that. And the third of the four guidelines I wanted to present textual meanings are always in flux. They're always changing. in hermeneutics, we cannot make an assumption that the way we read the text now is the same way it was read 100 years ago, or 500, or 1,000, or at the time that the text itself was written. Because the meaning that is invested in it will be in flux as a result of the change in context, in political context, and so on. Let me give you one example. There's that famous verse in 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita where Krishna says, Api chet suduracharo bhajate mam ananya bhag sadhureva samantavya samyak vyavasito hisa. He says that if someone, api chet sudurachara, if someone is a durachara, does something terrible, is a bad actor in this world, durachara, sudurachara, very bad, api chet, even if he is, bhajate mam, if he worships me, ananya bhag, with no other attention, no other focus, sadhur eva samantavya, he should be considered a sadhu. So what does this mean? I mean, this is a very morally, ethically difficult and confusing passage. Does it mean that I can go out and murder someone, but I am a bhakta, and I have tika and all of that, so it's okay. I should be considered a sadhu. Of course, no one except the ignorant have interpreted the passage in that way. No commentator has used it to justify immorality or violence or whatever. But how it has been interpreted has changed over time. So if you look at Ramanujacharya's commentary on this passage, Apichet Sudurachara, he takes Sudurachara in the context of caste. He says Sudurachara means even someone who breaks caste rules, so they are of a lower caste, but they interact with, behave as, and so on, cross boundaries into the upper caste. Even if someone is socially, in terms of their caste status, unacceptable and improper, it's okay. If that person is a bhakta, they should still be considered a sadhu. Okay? So he's using it to push back against the caste hierarchies that are present during his time. Those hierarchies permeate, if we look at the historical context, they would have permeated all of society during his time. And he's raising a question mark there. If you look at most contemporary commentators on Bhagavad Gita, caste is durachara, and almost none of them read durachara as someone who is breaking caste rules. Because that's not how we see durachara today. Rather, all of them read durachara in terms of, not all of them, but most of them read it in terms of a moral or ethical transgression. Why? Because in our contemporary society, that is the main concern that we use to look at others. And so commentators will say, if someone makes a moral transgression, not intentionally, but accidentally, you have a fall down, you stumble, you do something wrong. It's an accident, and your intention, samyak vyavasito hisa, your intention is samyak, it's good, you're a bhakta, then your mistake can be forgiven. So it's described in the context of forgiveness and in the context of accident. There's nothing in the verse that speaks of accident, that it's an accidental mistake. Nothing says that. But the commentators today will read it like that. Why? Because the context has changed. So we cannot go back and say, oh, Ramanuja was concerned about accidental moral mistakes. He's not. The meaning of the text has been in flux over time based on the context in which it has been interpreted. So meanings are always changing. They're always in flux. Okay, so the question, excellent question, is can we say that faithful translation is impossible because textual meanings are always in flux? I will address that question directly in just a little bit, okay? We're going to raise the question of translation, and we're going to ask exactly this question and then discuss it together. So you're anticipating what's coming, which is excellent, okay? So just, this is the sign when a class is going well and the students are sharp, is when they're one step ahead of you. You're pointing them and they're ready to grab. Huh? Sure, sure. But hopefully the principles are clear.
One chapter in my MPhil on hermeneutics, MPhil on interpretation and hermeneutics of a Marathi novel translated into English. So that's how I know this. And I don't know about religious studies or anything. And again, PhD translation and what have been this idea of afterlife.
The process of hermeneutics is born in the context of Western literature and English literature. So definitely your background is very relevant to this. We're applying it specifically in the context of religious studies, but that method has been used before religious studies. It was used in English literature. That application is older.
Bhagavad Gita, Shankaracharya, the term Loka Sangraha, he interprets it as welfare. Whereas Madhusudana Saraswati, writing in the 16th century, he interprets it from the point of view of caste rules. How a king or the person should ensure that the caste rules are not broken. So I was reminded of that.
Another example of how difference in context changes the interpretation. Thank you. Okay, and then the fourth one, the final one, is the most subversive. Okay, it's the most challenging, which is the hermeneut has to ask the question, whose interests are preserved and promoted within the text? This is the most subversive because it doesn't take what is being said at face value. I gave you the example of blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. When we did a Marxist interpretation of that, then we asked the question, whose interests are being promoted here? And Marx would say, actually the interests of the rulers are being promoted in this passage. A liberation theologian would say, no, it's the interests of the poor, of the meek, that are being promoted in this passage. The question of what's at stake, who's winning and who's losing in any passage is something that we have to ask, and is often a very difficult question to ask, particularly for someone who holds that text sacred themselves. I'll give you one example. Perhaps some of you may be familiar with this story, but there's the story of Jaya and Vijaya's fall from Vaikuntha. The four Kumaras are going up to heaven, to Vaikuntha, to see Vishnu. They come to the door, and the gatekeepers, Jaya and Vijay, stop them. They get really angry, the Kumaras, and they curse Jaya and Vijay to fall down to earth, to give up their position in heaven, in Vaikuntha. When that happens, Jaya and Vijay are repentant. They fall at the Kumara's feet, and Vishnu comes running from inside Vaikuntha to help sort out the situation. When he comes out, he sides on the surface, at least, with the Kumaras, with the four boys, and he's raising the question. He's saying there's beautiful verses, 10, 15 verses, where he's praising on and on the Brahmanas. He's saying, they are like my own heart. These virtuous Brahmanas, they have good qualities. They are like my own heart. I will do anything for them. He says, even if you were to cut off both of my arms, I would do that for your sake. And he's indirectly saying, Jaya and Vijay are my arms, and you've just cut them off. So he's also providing indirect criticism, but on the surface, he's going on and on praising them. A hermeneut who is using this question, whose interests are being promoted, would ask in that situation, who's benefiting from this passage? Clearly, it's the Brahmins who are benefiting. Who is the author? Who are writing these passages? Clearly, it is the Brahmins who are writing the passage. So the authors are promoting their own interests within the text. Now, this is tough, right? It's difficult. Because for someone who is a bhakta, a devotee who is reading the text from the perspective of personal transformation, they will typically read the passage and say, this is speaking of someone who has certain good qualities. It's not speaking about caste. It's speaking about someone who has certain Brahminical qualities that are available to anyone, that are present in anyone, that can be present in anyone, like peacefulness and austerity and virtue and so on. So the devotees today will usually not read that passage in the context of caste, but rather say the Lord loves those who are virtuous in nature, regardless of their caste background. But if we were to do a historical and critical interpretation using this question, then we have to raise that issue, and it can be destabilizing. It can be challenging for the person of faith. Christianity has been through this for centuries now. Historical criticism, hermeneutics, and all of this was, as you said, primarily and initially applied to the Bible. And it was not an easy process. Christianity was transformed and changed significantly over the centuries as a result of the difficult questions that hermeneutes and textual critical scholars asked of these texts. It's a challenge, but once again, let me say that it is not incompatible with a position of faith. That's a different question in regards to the relationship between personal faith and scholarship. That's a question that I think about a lot because I'm also, as you probably guess, a man of faith myself. And yet I study texts using historical criticism and hermeneutics, study the very texts which I also read as sacred scripture. This is the particular challenge of religious studies. This is what makes religious studies such a pain. Is that sometimes I think it would have been so much easier if I had become a mathematics professor. I did my undergraduate in mathematics also. I had a dual focus, math and philosophy. And I thought, at least if you're a professor of mathematics, the subject is difficult, but there's no question of will it change your worldview? Will it affect your students? Will it destroy their faith? None of those questions arise. You just teach it. Either you understand it or you don't understand it. If you don't understand it, I try again. But religious studies is difficult. It's a pain because specifically it deals with questions of ultimate value in a way that ignores their ultimate value. You see the issue? It deals with text. The passage that I described is a beautiful one from the Bhagavad, one of my favorite. It's wonderful, it's lovely, and it can be understood in a way that has nothing to do with caste hierarchies. That is causes personal growth. But if I read it like this, I must read it like this as a scholar as well, to be aware of the potential impact that the text has. Because the text has been used in the past to promote the interests of particular classes of people. Religious texts can be used as instruments of peace. They can be used as weapons for violence. Yes, yes.
If we read over the episode across Harivamsha, Vishnu Puran, Bhagavad Puran, and Bhagavad Puran, we realize that in Harivamsha and Vishnu Puran there is more emphasis on mountain worship. But as we go further, particularly in Bhagavad Puran, Krishna has got more importance, and in Brahma Puran, the Brahmana worship is more glorified. So we can see that change. And those actually verses which are glorifying Brahmana worship, which is in Brahma Puran, are significantly absent from the earlier text. So we can see this point there. Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. So this raises another important point that comparative textual analysis is also a very useful tool. Yes. 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 So the technical term there is intertextuality. That we look at the same passage, the same idea across multiple texts. And that gives us exposure. It shows us, it reveals to us aspects in the text that we are interested in that we would have otherwise missed by comparing it with another text that is in a different time period or different era. It's like holding up a mirror. Intertextuality, it holds up a mirror to a text. So you see what is unique, what is different in that work. If you study, for example, the Narasimha story between Vishnu Purana and Bhagavata Purana, you come to recognize, even though the Bhagavata's version has now become canonical, has become standard for most Hindus, when they think of a story of an avatar, they're deeply influenced by the Bhagavata's version. But if you take the Bhagavata's version, you compare it to the Vishnu Puran's version, those things that you assume to be a normal part of the story for everyone, you recognize, no, actually this is unique to the Bhagavad. Because Vishnu Purana does not have this, and Harivamsha does not have that, right? So this is a double-edged sword. You can see how the story has changed and how the text is different, but you can also come to appreciate the unique aspects of your text, right? And this is how that sort of analysis can also go hand in hand with faith. Because you can look at the text and you can say, actually, the text I'm reading is doing something special here. It's doing something unique. If you look at biblical texts and you compare them with the Gnostic Gospels, you come to recognize that the New Testament authors are doing something different, right? They're doing something special. They're creating a certain theology which deepens your appreciation for the text you are studying. So this can cause skepticism and loss of faith. It can also cause a deepening of understanding and faith, depending on what aspect of it or how you're looking at it. So this is all to point out that, as I started at the beginning, religious studies is not promoting nor destroying any particular religion. It's simply trying to analyze it with greater depth to lead to greater understanding. Okay. So I'm going to skip one particular section that I was going to do. If we have time at the end, we'll come back to it. Okay. But I want to now go to the. I have a colleague who, whenever the cell phone goes off in a classroom, he always stops the conversation and he says, "Oh, it's my mother calling. You know, she can find me anywhere. Here, give me the phone. Let me speak to her." And then he'll take the phone and talk to the person who's there. After the first time this happens in the classroom, it never happens again. Okay. So, now we have to raise the question that was the title of my talk, which is a hermeneutics of translation. What happens when we try to apply these ideas and these techniques in the context of translating a work? And not just any work. So I'm not talking about translating your local newspaper. This means we're looking specifically at the question of how do you translate a work that is a classic literature. Now, this term classic work, is one that we use frequently, and we all mean something by it. And so I want to ask you, this is important for the question of translation. If I say something is a classic of literature, what does that mean to you? What is the characteristic? What are the characteristics of classic works of literature? Tell me, what does that mean to you? What makes something a classic? If you were to look at a book and I gave you, the most recent copy of the Hindustan Times or Times of India, is that a classic? Most people would say, no, it's not a classic, it's a newspaper. What makes something a classic? Yes. It has withstood the test of time. So it has lived across many periods of time. It has spoken to different people in different historical periods. That is an important characteristic of a classic. Excellent. Someone else? Yes. It is? Okay. So it has let's just say it has spoken to many, right? that it's not just something like my personal diary. It speaks to me. And anyone who looks into it, they might look at it and go, oh, what is this, right? It won't speak to them. But a classic is something that will speak to many across time and across cultures. Please explain. Okay. So, yes. So Professor Bose is pointing out something very important here. That if we were to step aside from those inherent and pure characteristics of a text, right, and we were to ask the more subversive question that we were asking earlier, whose interest and who's benefiting, then there's certain political contexts and situations that lead rise to a certain text becoming canonized as this is the classic of literature. Like if you look at Bhagavad Gita, for example, at a certain point in the history of Hinduism, Bhagavad Gita becomes the sacred book of Hinduism. This happens at a particular moment in Hinduism's history for multiple political reasons as well, particularly in the context of the colonial presence within India, and with the presence of Christians and Muslims on the subcontinent. Hinduism attempts to reshape itself as a religion of the book. I have the Bible, you have the Quran. What is your book? What is your book? And the answer to that question was never simple in the past, because Hinduism was not a religion of the book. There were many books, depending on your sampradaya, depending on your background, depending on your emphasis. But at a certain point, Hindus begin to hold up Bhagavad Gita as the book. And so often you hear people say, the Gita is the Bible of Hinduism. Right? Because it makes sense politically to canonize a particular text at that time. So here also the politics and the history of it is important. Excellent. What else are characteristics that one would say of it? Yes. So its ability, yes, to shape a culture. It has the ability to shape. Classic texts are foundational to a culture. They help shape that culture over time. Professor David Tracy, he's a theologian at the University of Chicago. He provides a definition for a classic. That is, he doesn't say this is it, but this is his understanding of a classic. I'll read it to you. He says, to understand the concrete, we always need good examples. Among good examples, some stand out as paradigmatic. Among good examples of written texts, the truly exemplary ones are named classics. The classics, therefore, are exemplary examples. As such, they are a good test case for any interpretation theory. So a classic is a good test case for hermeneutics. If you have a hermeneutical theory and it doesn't work on any classic work, then you have to rethink your hermeneutics. Right? Excellent. You just anticipated his next sentence. This is exactly what he says next. He says, actually it's 2 sentences down, but I'll skip to that. He says, on more explicitly hermeneutical grounds, classics are those texts that bear an excess of meaning. Okay? An excess of meaning means that the meaning of the work can never be contained in the mind of a single interpreter. No one can look at Bhagavad Gita and say, I've read it, here's what it means, matter is finished. If that were the case, then after Adi Shankaracharya's commentary, we would have no other commentaries. Even someone as revered and as knowledgeable as him is then, we move on from his commentary, and again and again and again, there's more and more meaning that is present, right? So there's an excess of meaning. A classic is a work whose meaning cannot be contained. It cannot be held within the bounds of the pages or the words of the text. It cannot even be held within the bounds of the historical context within which it was born. This is not the case with all works. If you have a travel guide to China or something, you don't want an excess of meaning in that. You can go to this hotel, and that hotel may be here, it might be there, or depending how you interpret the sentence, this might be this hotel or that hotel. An excess of meaning will get you lost, right? That's not the intention. But a classic is one that speaks to multiple audiences over time, and therefore has, he says, an excess and permanence of meaning. Okay, so this is the test of time that we say. As such, on historical grounds, classics are simply those texts that have helped found or form a particular culture. And then he says, this excess and permanence of meaning. Classics are those works that resist definitive interpretation. This is the point you were making. They resist definitive interpretation. And this is why, when someone is studying a classic and they say, this is the only meaning of Bhagavad Gita, this is it, or this is the only meaning of the Bible, or this is what the Quran says, a religious studies scholar is highly skeptical. This usually is veering in the direction of fanaticism. When there's a refusal to accept multiplicity within a text, and there's an insistence on definitive interpretation. This is it. Then this is more or less moving in the direction of fanaticism. In their production, in the production of the text, there's also the following paradox. Although the classic is highly particular in its origin, classics have the possibility of being universal in effect. This is the tension within which the hermeneut must always live. When you read a text, you're always conscious of the particularity of its origin. This was written by these people at this point in history with this purpose in mind. That insight of when it was written, at what time, its particularity, is actually helps us to understand its universality. That it's particular in its origin, but it's universal in its effect. Yeah, and then the last thing he says, we can drift half asleep through non-classic period pieces. We cannot with classics. Indeed, the temptation to domesticate all reality is a temptation that any classic text will resist. The classics resist our ingrained laziness and self-satisfaction. Their claim to attention must be heeded if understanding is not to slide into either domesticating similarity or mere sameness. And then the last line is my favorite. Classics, whether texts, symbols, events, persons, or rituals, command our attention. A classic is a work that you cannot ignore. You may hate it, you may dislike it, but you cannot ignore it. That is a classic. That's a classic work. Now, the big question for us is, if we are given the task of translating a classic, how do you do that? With something that has so much that is packed into it. Excess of meaning, historical context, something that commands our attention. And then you're told, now put it into English. Or translate it into Bengali or whatever. That's a tall order for the translator. That's a difficult, if not impossible task to capture all of that. It is indeed a very rare translation. There are some, but it's rare, where the translation itself becomes a classic. That type of, and the example that comes to mind immediately for me is the King James Version of the Bible. That version itself has become a classic of English literature. Even though it's a translation, and even though today biblical scholars will say that there are many things wrong in the translation, technically speaking, and yet no one can ignore it. The King James Version is taught in English departments all over the world as a piece of literature. So it resists. Okay. So, wonderful question. Yeah. So, the question is, if something, how do you, so if a text resists definitive interpretation on the one hand, okay, so there's a multiplicity of meaning, and yet the text carries certain authority, and authority comes with a certain boundary of meaning, right? And this question is in many ways related, I think, to the question that you asked earlier, which is, are there, I think it was you, are there boundaries to translate? Yes. So both of these questions we have to address, okay? Which is the fact that we're translating a classic, and a classic is overflowing with meaning, and every translation is an interpretation, okay? Because as you're reading it, as you're translating it, you are forced to select a certain range of meanings to convey in your translation and ignore others, simply because words do not overlap exactly in their range of meaning in different languages. So, to take a classic example, the word dharma. It's nearly impossible to translate. You can choose law if you want, and you will capture certain aspects of the word dharma, and you will completely miss out other aspects. You can choose occupation, you can choose caste, you can choose nature, you can choose world order, the natural order of the world. All of those are possible translations, none of which capture the exact same range of meanings. What you will end up doing is, if you take a word, and I'm coming to the question, okay, so we just have to build up to it here in a second. But say you take a word like dharma, and dharma has a certain range of meanings that are available, okay, in Sanskrit, and I choose the word dharma as nature. The dharma of an object, it's nature. So now the range of meanings that the English word nature has are approximately like this. Okay? There's aspects of the word nature that correspond very well with dharma. The dharma of sugar is to be sweet. Okay? It means the nature of sugar is to be sweet. But the word nature in English also means the natural world. Right? Yeah. And if I say nature, if I translate dharma as creation or environment, I'm pushing it. Outside, I'm using nature. It can mean, I use this word, there's a risk that your reader is going to take a meaning out here and connect it with dharma that should not be connected. Isn't it? So you run the risk of introducing new meaning into a text that was not intended in the historical context in which it was created. You also have the risk of taking another meaning, dharma as law, which is completely missed when you take nature. Right? So your reader, if there is a sense in which the text is hinting at law, your reader will completely miss that if you translate it as nature. This is the challenge with translation. Given the fact, so you have to choose as the translator. That means you're working as an interpreter. You are a hermeneut when you are translating. Now, back to the question. If every translation is an interpretation, and classic is a work that has multiple interpretations, that resist definitive interpretation, then does that mean that any translation is okay, that we can pull out any meaning from the text that we want, that the text can mean anything we like, that there's no space for authority, there's no space for boundaries? And the answer is no. it is indeed possible, as a translator, as an interpreter, even with a classic that is overflowing with meaning, it is possible to commit violence to the text. And by that I mean it is possible to push the text in directions that are inappropriate to its historical context, that are inappropriate to the author's intention, that move the text in a way that divorces it from its cultural background and its cultural context, in a way that moves the text in a direction that makes it foreign to the people who hold it sacred in the context of religion. One can push the text in a direction so far that we have committed violence to the text, that we have overstepped our boundaries as hermeneutes and translators, even with a work that is overflowing in meaning. The key question, of course, is what are those boundaries? At what point have we pulled out meanings that are improper, that are unjustified, that are even violent to the text itself? How do we know when we've gone that far? So the question at hand is, what makes a good translation? What makes something a good translation? Now, in order to answer that question, we have to ask one question before that, which is, what affects translation? Any translation. What affects it? A translator needs to be very clear as to not just the nature of the text, but the process of translation, and of what they, as the translator, what I, as the translator, are bringing to the text and putting into it. Without that knowledge, I'm going to end up moving the text in directions that I have no idea what I'm doing. It's going to be an ignorant translation. So let me ask you this question, okay? This is an open question for you. What affects the translation of any work? What's going to affect it or change the nature of the translation or, give me some thoughts. Fundamental, your proficiency in the language is going to affect the translation. Whichever translation, whichever language, for example, is your primary language. Say you're doing a translation from Bengali to English. If Bengali is your mother tongue, that brings a certain understanding of the language that someone who is writing from English as their mother tongue may not have access to. Certain colloquialisms, certain depth of understanding that a Bengali native speaker would understand if they're translating a Bengali work. But if that Bengali translator is translating into English, and English is their second language, then that person is also working with certain limitations because the target language is not their language. On the other hand, someone for whom their mother tongue is English, if they're translating a Bengali work, they may miss some of the subtleties that come with being an insider to the language, but the language that they are translating into is theirs. And they know how to manipulate and work the words of English far better than that Bengali translator. You see? So it's not an easy thing. Proficiency in language, there's pros and cons. There's benefits and difficulties in either direction. What else? What else will affect the translation that you do? Yes? Huh?
Yes. Who is your audience? Actually, you mentioned two things.
Up on the board. Language ability. Your audience. Who are you writing this for? If you're doing a translation of Bhagavad Gita for students who are not Hindus, your translation is going to be deeply affected by that fact. If you're writing for your disciples who are practicing the Gita, your translation is going to be affected by that, isn't it? So your audience is crucial as well. Yes. So we have to be conscious of our prejudice. Now, postmodern scholarship tells us very clearly that it is not possible to be entirely objective, to be without prejudice. Okay? Because we have to stand somewhere. Where interpretation means examining anything, but when you're looking at anything, you have to have a certain perspective. I'm looking at all of you, but my perspective is colored by the fact that I'm standing here, and I have a certain view, and certain people I can see clearly, and others I can't. If I were to stand in the back of the room, my perspective would be very different in terms of who I see and who I miss. So there's no perspective from nowhere. There's no universal perspective except that of God. And we, of course, we already said that we cannot access his perspective for our purposes here. So there's going to be prejudice. There's going to be some sort of subjectivity. The key thing is to be conscious of one's subjectivities, to be conscious of one's prejudices. Because if we go into it without that consciousness, we make the mistake of saying, oh, I'm reading this text in an objective fashion, and I've understood it. When the reality is, the fact that you were born in this background and you grew up with this religious idea means that when you read the text, these things will stand out for you. This is why when different people read the same sacred work, or even the same work of literature, it doesn't have to be sacred, different things jump out at them, different things strike them, and others will ignore the same thing. Excellent. What else will affect your translation? Yes, yes. I want to make sure I get, there were some other hands up as well. What else will affect your translation? If you're trying to translate a work, what else is going to affect it?
Cultural context.
Good. Knowledge of context. We've already discussed this. Is going to affect it as well.
Knowledge of culture or understanding of culture also.
Excellent. Knowledge of culture, understanding of culture, yes.
Peer review.
Peer review. So putting it through a body of peers who can read it and criticize it. People are very, very generous, our peers, with their criticism, and it helps.
Even the background of the author.
Yes, the background of the author itself. So we can continue to list many things like this. The one thing I want to highlight for our purposes that will affect the translation is the translator's hermeneutical principles. What hermeneutical principles
Are operative in your translation? I'll give you some examples here. As you're translating a text, there might be many different hermeneutical principles that you can take as operative when you read a particular work. Okay? So here's an example. The basic range of meaning of a word can be determined by consulting tradition. So you look at the historical tradition and the range of meanings that are possible for a verse or a word. That range I can get by looking at the tradition from the beginning to the contemporary time. This is where questions of authority can become important. Which ones am I considering authoritative? Why are they authoritative? What constitutes authority? Are they authoritative because they are given by the leaders of the tradition? Are they authoritative because they have academic credibility? What is the range of authority that is present there? Another example. These are not good or bad. They're just examples. As a hermeneutical principle, I will always use the same English word to translate the same Sanskrit word. There's one translation of Bhagavad Gita where the author makes this clear, that his primary goal is to show how the word karma in all of its forms, kar, krita, karma, karya, in all of its forms, is something that is so crucial in Bhagavad Gita You find it across the text. So he uses the same English root, act, the word act, and its derivatives to translate the root kar in any time it appears. So act, action, activity, actuality, he'll use the root word act in order to indicate to the reader, see, the same theme is being hit upon. Now, let me ask you, what is the potential drawback of that hermeneutical principle? I told you its benefit, right? Someone can choose that hermeneutical principle for the purpose of demonstrating threads, common themes that run through a work. If you use the same word in English, always to translate any derivative of the root kar in Sanskrit, that means your reader is very clearly aware of how important action is in Bhagavad Gita. What's the potential drawback in that situation? Exactly. So this operates on a very important assumption that the range of meanings in the English word act is identical with the range of meanings in the Sanskrit root kar, and that assumption, of course, is not true. And so occasionally what happens is that this author uses the word act in a way that is a little bit stretched. So in the first translation, in the first verse, Dharma kshetre kurukshetre samaveta yuyutsava Mahamaka Pandavasyeva Kim Akurvata Sanjaya. Most translators say, what did they do? Kim Akurvata. What did they do? They use the word do. But with his promise to show how action is important from the first verse of the Gita to the last word, he translates it, how did they act? Now, there's a certain challenge there. Because in English, the word act can also mean pretense. It can mean like play, right? How did they act? Not what did they genuinely do, but how did they act? Like they're putting on a performance. So your reader might get what you're intending, but they might also get a meaning that's out here a little bit. So every hermeneutical principle comes with its pros and cons. Okay? This is the point I want to make, is that there's no perfect hermeneutics. Okay? You're not going to come to a set of hermeneutical principles, this is it. This is what I use to translate Kavya or Shastra or whatever. This is the right one. No. We have to make a selection of what our hermeneutical principles are, and then we have to live with the consequences of that decision. And we have to be explicit about it. A good translation is one that is explicit about its hermeneutical principles. If you're explicit, you're letting the readers know, this is what I'm choosing, and this is why I'm doing it. Yes, Mos?
Makes meaning only in relation to other words. Within the arrangement of words, one word makes meaning. So if we choose to translate one word with one fixed meaning in the target language, then we are missing the point that it is taking another guise in a separate arrangement.
So a wonderful and very sophisticated critique of that hermeneutical principle.
Not only is the range of meanings going to be different, but meaning is produced in context. It's produced in relation to other words. And to assume that just if you use the word kar in Sanskrit, that it's going to mean the same thing every time, just because it's the same root, ignores the fact that the meaning of the word kar will be affected by the words that come before and after it. And same thing with the word act in English. Excellent point. Wonderful. Yes?
We have synonyms, like for example in Amar Kosham, but the shade of meaning can be different. It's not the same meaning every time. The shade of meaning can also change. So the English replacement also has to be in the context of that shade of meaning. Yes.
Exactly.
By using only one act and how do they act, it would be more of a biased way rather than giving an interpretation which can give better meanings, many meanings are available.
Yes.
Such things also is excluded totally by using that word.
Yes. Yes. So excellent. I mean, all of these are significant critiques of that hermeneutical principle. But let me point out
that the motivation behind that principle is also laudable in the sense that the translator is trying to do something which no other translator has done, which is to point out to the reader the importance and patterns that are present in the Sanskrit across all 700 verses. Because translators typically keep changing their translation of Kar every time they come to it, sometimes do, sometimes act, sometimes behave, sometimes this and that, and you miss the fact that Kar or karma is so important in the Gita, and there's clear patterns in how. Sometimes Krishna uses the word, some word connected with the root Kar 6 times in the same shloka. Karma, akarma, vikarma. And in English, a principle of good writing is that you don't repeat words again and again. You use synonyms. And so most translators do that. They use synonyms. But what does the reader lose? They lose the fact that Krishna is repeating himself multiple times with the same word. They lose the impact of repetition and the impact of meditation that's present in a text that uses the same word repeatedly again and again. So, every hermeneutical principle comes with its certain pros and cons associated with it. Here's a couple more that I'll mention. These are just examples, okay? Another possible hermeneutical principle, I will convey the intended meaning of the text even if I have to sacrifice literalness. So I'll say, this is the spirit of the work, and I will convey that even if that's not what it literally says. That can be a fine hermeneutical principle for certain people who are translating with a certain goal or a certain agenda. If you're translating a work of poetry and you want to convey the emotional power of that work, maybe you're less concerned with getting the exact literal words right, because you want to convey that impact. Why? Because that's your audience. That's your purpose. That's your agenda. If you're attempting to create a transformation in the heart of your readers, maybe it doesn't matter so much that your word for word is not exactly literal. On the other hand, someone might take the opposite hermeneutical principle. They might say, I will stick to the literal meaning even if I have to sacrifice poetic impact. Even if the poetic power is a little bit weakened, it's okay. I'm going to be literal. That's my primary intent. Why? Because I'm writing for a group of Sanskrit students or something, and I'm trying to teach them what each word means, or whatever might be your reason for that. Either way, you're going to gain something, and you're going to sacrifice something in the case of your translation. What are you trying to achieve? So, there's 2 translations of Bhagavad Gita that I wanted to compare. Now the handout, yes.
Possible, as all of us know, that this genre novel got translated into Marathi as well as in other Indian languages as Kadambar. So is it not counterproductive to restrict this idea, this translation, this metaphoric translation only to the text? Because it is possible to translate genre, it is possible to translate the ideas like French Revolution ideas like liberty, fraternity, those were translated into Hindi and here in India. So, I would like to cite another example that was Hamlet was translated into Marathi first time in 1883, and that the translation was criticized by the scholars saying that it is a bad translation. But the performance of the play was popular among the audience because Hamlet represented the Indian intellectuals of colonial period. Hamlet's uncle represented the British government everything in India. So, these are these 2 questions that really possible to make
Both excellent questions, and I okay, let's come back together. I think there are two excellent questions. First of all, on authorial intent. This is, if we look at modern literary criticism in the postmodern era, then the answer to the question is no. you cannot understand the author's intent. Nor is the attempt to understand the author's intent useful, because that is in itself conditioned by a context that we don't have access to anyone's mental state. What we have access to is context. So we cannot, and the words on the page. Yes. At the same time, I should mention that this is a particular perspective on authorial intent. That there are other perspectives where authorial intent is something that is important in study. And particularly in religious studies, there's a difference of viewpoint. So there are those who take a postmodern view and say, no, authorial intent is impossible to achieve, I will not look at it. And others who say, no, it is useful to at least try to reconstruct authorial intent. And if only for the purpose of better understanding the text, that we go back and attempt at a reconstruction of it. So there's a difference of opinion there, although your point is well taken, that I think the majority perspective within postmodern literary criticism is that no, authorial intent cannot be achieved. I should mention that in a religious context, authorial intent is everything, right? Because authority is founded on authorial intent, right? Authority and author is clearly related. And so if we're trying to get at what is the authority of the text, typically the religious hermeneut, the religious reader, is going to say, this translation of mine is appropriate, is right, is correct, is authoritative, because it matches with the author's intention. So when we're looking at what affects translation, we can put down here authority as well. Authority affects translation. And authority, one of the biggest things that drive authority is authorial intent. So in a religious context, it can be quite crucial. In postmodern literary criticism, it's considered to be inaccessible. Now, your second question was on the... Yeah. So on the texts, so this is something I should have mentioned at the beginning of my seminar. My seminar is restricting intentionally the notion of text to words on a page. And the reason for that is simply on a practical level in terms of trying to cover enough material. But there's no reason to think of text merely as written word, or translation merely as the process of changing one set of written words into another set of written words. In fact, both text and translation are so much broader than that. Texts can include oral, verbal communication. It can include non-verbal communication. It can include persons. It can be ritual. It can be genres. It can be ideas. All of those can be considered to be text. Right? And therefore, translation then can encompass all of those activities. In fact, in my job as a teacher, I see my work as the work of a translator. When I'm in a classroom and I'm teaching an idea, say I'm teaching Upanishads to students who have never heard of the text before, what am I doing? I'm translating, right? I'm essentially taking a set of ideas that is foreign to them and putting it in another set of ideas, in another context that is familiar to them, right? So you're taking the foreign and making it familiar. And if I can just digress a little bit, half the time you're going in the other direction. You're taking that which is familiar and you're making it foreign to them. So they think they understand Hamlet because they've heard it. To be or not to be, that is the question. But if you start to actually teach it in a classroom, they start to realize, actually, I don't know Hamlet. It's something very foreign to me. I assumed it was this. I thought the Gita was this. I thought I knew it because I know it from my childhood, right? So everyone, any Hindu you meet, you say, this is the Gita. They'll say, I know. But the task of the teacher is to make it foreign to them. To say, actually, you don't know the Gita. If you read it in its historical context, do you recognize this about the text? If you read it in its social context, do you recognize this? So the job of the teacher is to make that which is familiar foreign, and that which is foreign familiar. That's what we have to do in the classroom. And so one of my colleagues, he puts it very well. He says, the job of a teacher is to comfort the disturbed, to disturb the comfortable. Which is the same thing put in the context of a translation, is to say, My job is to translate the familiar into the foreign and the foreign into the familiar. If I can accomplish that, if my students say, I know this, I understand it, I've grown up with this, my job is to show them, you don't know it. Look again. Why? Because remember that first hermeneutical principle. Read again and read thoroughly, and you will see things that you did not see. That's my job. And if a student comes to me and says, I don't know anything about this, this is too foreign, it could not possibly be relevant to me, or that's just an exotic culture, it's for those Indians out there thousands of miles away. My job in the classroom is to say, look again, this is actually more familiar than you think it is. It deals with the same human concerns that your text deals with as well. And it may speak to you, even though you are not Indian, even though you are not Hindu, it will speak to you. Why? Because it's a classic. And a classic is one that stands the test of time and geography and all that. So that is what I see as my role as a teacher, is basically as a translator, essentially. A teacher is a translator, is a hermeneut. Okay. So anyway, I don't think we have time for these handouts. But you have them anyway. Basically, what I've given you in the handouts, this is the introduction to 2 translations of Bhagavad Gita, both done by Americans, one Graham Schweig and the other Laurie Patton. And what they do, you won't have time to read it now, but if you read their translations and you read it with this eye, what we've talked about, you can go through each one. If this were a 1-week-long course, what I would do is in the next session is I would ask you to read it at home and to list for me the hermeneutical principles articulated by the translators. Okay? And since there's no time to read it, I'll give you the answer right now. Both of them, Schweig and Patton, they share certain hermeneutical principles. Okay? So, for example, they're both attempting to capture the poetic quality of the text. This is why they translate the Gita into verse, into English verse, rather than into prose, which is how a lot of translators do it. They're also interested in unpacking compound words, samasas. So they say, look, if something is a samasa, like patanga, right? Patanga means moth. Krishna uses this word, or Sanjay uses this word in chapter 11, patanga. If you unpack the compound, then pat means to fall or to fly, and ga means to go. So that which is the flying goer or the flying faller, this adds something to unpack the compound. It gives some meaning. So they both say one of our hermeneutical principles is that we will unpack the meaning of compounds. They share this in common. But there are differences in their hermeneutical principles. Patton says that the Sanskrit of the Gita is simple, it's direct, and it's punchy, it's powerful. So she attempts to capture the Gita's meaning, the shlokas in her translation, in very short verses that keep the brevity and the rhythm, the punch of the text. She says, I want to convey that liveliness of the work in short, just like Gita, each only 32 syllables in an Anushtup shloka. So she says, why should the English be long? We'll also keep it short. If the Sanskrit can do it in 32 syllables, then I'm going to try to do it, not in 32 exactly, she says, but I'll keep it short and brief. Schweig, on the other hand, says exactly the opposite. And I encourage you to read this in your own time. He says, because Sanskrit is an inflected language, inflected meaning it has the case endings, right, at the end. Krishna, 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 Krishna. Yeah. Case endings. There's case endings that Purushaha, Purushao, Purushaha, Purusham, Purusham. Vibhakti, yes. Because it has these vibhaktis and these suffixes and so on, therefore Sanskrit can convey in a shorter amount of space what English needs more words for. So you have to say deshe, in the land, but In Sanskrit, you can say it in one word, deshe. And you can use the saptami vibhakti, and you've got it. In English, you cannot say lande, it doesn't work. So you have to say in the land, right? In the land. You now need 3 words. So his point is, you cannot capture the brevity of the English. Rather, I want to capture the full range of meaning and poetic beauty. So I will use as many words as is necessary to unpack the full range of meaning that is present there. You see, they're using opposite hermeneutical principles. One is pointing to the brevity of the work and trying to capture that, which is laudable, but it loses something. The other is trying to capture the richness of the language, but sacrificing brevity for that purpose. I'll show you one example in your handout, and then we'll end. Okay? So go to your handout, and chapter 11, text 29. So if you go to the Schweig handout, Ram Schweig's, go to the last page. This is chapter 11, the Vishvarupa. Krishna's cosmic form is being described here. And it's Arjuna speaking. It's a moment of great power and fear and amazement. So look at, so on the bottom right side, in verse number 29, Yatha pradiptam jvalanam patanga. Sorry, this is not in Devanagari. This is how it was published. Vishanti nashaya samriddha vega. Tathaiva nashaya vishanti lokas tavapi vaktrani samriddha vega. Immediately you should notice a few things about the verse. Number one, there's repetition. The word samriddha vega is repeated twice. In fact, there's a lot of repetition. Vishanti nashaya samriddha vega. In the next line, nashaya vishanti, and then samriddha vega. So practically there's a whole sentence, a whole line in the verse that is repeated twice. This is the moment at which Arjuna is seeing that all these beings are flying to their deaths into Krishna's mouths, which are blazing like fire, like moths go into a flame. Okay? So this is a fearsome, powerful moment. Let's look at how both translators deal with this. Let's go to the other one first, Patton. The other handout. Keep the Sanskrit in front of you from the first handout. And in the other handout, go to verse 29. Everyone have it? So, Patton's handout, verse 29. The page number is 131 on the upper right-hand corner. Got it? Okay. She writes, Laurie Patton translates, as moths that fly to their full will rush to death in the blazing fire, so too worlds rush to death in your mouths. Short, punchy, brief. How has she translated Samriddha Vega? Anyone? Samriddha Vega, Samriddha means great or intense. Vega means speed. So Samriddha Vega, what has she done? Rush. One word. Rush. Vishanti means enter. How is she translated Vishanti? Rush is Samriddha Vega. What has she done with Vishanti? Verb. They enter. Yeah. In. Just the word in. The word Vishanti, to enter. They enter. She has translated with the word in. Is that enough? This is the sacrifice. This is the question a translator has to address. Rush in. Is that enough for Vishanti Samriddha Vega? She feels it's enough. Schweig, on the other hand, says, no way. You cannot take a verb Vishanti and just translate it with a preposition in English, in. We need a verb for it. Vishanti is a verb. It conveys action. I need action. So now, go to your other handout. turn to his translation, so page 159 in the other handout, second to last page. No. So 29. You have it? Yeah. As moths, patanga, with great velocity, samriddha vega, enter a blazing fire unto their destruction. So enter is vishanti, nashaya, unto their destruction. As moths with great velocity enter a blazing fire unto their destruction, similarly the worlds also enter your mouths with great velocity unto their destruction. Repetition is stronger, isn't it? She has repetition, but it's weaker. It's just rush in, she does twice. Here the repetition is stronger. He's using so many more words. If you count the number of words, practically he's using double the number of words. And he's using enter with great velocity, a longer construction to bring out Vishanti Samriddha Vega. Can you refer specifically which one you're... So I know for a fact that Schweig is attempting to capture alliteration. This is one of his attempts. Okay? So it's up to you to decide which translation you like better. But my purpose is only to point out to you that a difference in hermeneutical principles, they each explicitly state their hermeneutical principles. Look at the difference in result. Two verses that have completely different impact on the reader in terms of emotional impact, in terms of intellectual impact, psychological, totally different, based on different hermeneutical principles. Am I going to convey the power, the brevity of the text, or am I going to convey its poetic elaboration? Depending on that, you'll translate very, very differently. So a good translation is one that makes those hermeneutical principles clear up front. It's not so much a question of a right or wrong translation. People look at it and say, oh, this is a bad translation. It's not literal, it's a bad translation. Well, what's your goal? Is literalness your goal? If you're writing to transform the reader and affect them emotionally, maybe a literal translation will be a very poor translation. On the other hand, if your goal is to teach someone Sanskrit, you definitely want a literal translation so they can match each word going up and down. Or if you're writing for a group of people who are not Hindus, who have never read the Gita, maybe a more academic, literal translation will be better. It's not a question of good or bad. It's a question of what are your hermeneutical principles and what is your agenda as a translator. Every translator has an agenda. But as translators, as hermeneutists, we have to make that agenda clear, front and center. This is what it is. And then we can hope to make a contribution. And if we're lucky, if we're very lucky, our translation will itself become a classic in the language that we're translating into. Usually it'll be after our death, though, so we won't get to enjoy the benefit. Thank you all very much for your attention. I appreciate it.